Karate, that's what's up, guys, in ancient Greek. I'm just kidding. I don't normally talk like that. I just thought it would be funny to make a parody of a YouTube video. So please smash that like and subscribe button. No, I'm joking. Don't do that. Welcome to AHIS 1000 Week 10. You can just pretend that you're back in 2020 and you have to do classes in lockdown. But to complete the parody of the YouTube video, I do have 5 crazy facts about the Peloponnesian War that will blow your mind. Well, maybe not. Anyway, fun fact number 1. The Athenians used social distancing to deal with a plague outbreak. So Thucydides says people were afraid to visit the sick. So this social distancing wasn't enforced by the government. It was just common sense in avoiding other infected people. But we'll talk more about this later. But social distancing wasn't a new thing. Crazy fact number 2. The Athenians have post-disaster sex as a response to the plague outbreak. So we'll talk about the plague outbreak in more detail later. Basically, after September 11, scientists came across this psychological phenomenon called post-disaster sex. People were terrified and wanted to have sex because they thought they were going to die. And it seems that something similar happened in Athens. So Thucydides 253, he says that because of the plague, there was a breakdown in morality and people started to do really lewd acts, but he doesn't specify what these lewd acts are. But the theory is it was post-disaster sex. Fun fact number 3, the Boeotians use a giant flamethrower to defeat the Athenians. So we'll also talk more about this a bit later. But this is possibly the first recorded use of a flamethrower in Western civilization. And fun fact number 4, the Spartan general Brasidas was deified and people worshipped him. We'll talk about Brasidas in detail when we get to him later. So basically, he gets worshipped as a hero, which is a semi-divine figure. He's a very interesting Spartan. And fun fact number 5, Thucydides is a character in his own story. So Thucydides himself is going to be part of the action this week. He refers to himself in the third person in his own writing. Says Thucydides, the son of Olorus, the author of this history, set sail with the 7 ships he had with him. That quote there. So that's another thing that's going to come up today. Okay, so today we'll be looking at the first phase of the Peloponnesian War, which is called the Archidamian War. Basically, the defining feature of this stage of the war is that the Athenians hide behind their walls, a bit like the French taunter in Monty Python, also a classic text of Western civilization, which you should watch. Okay, today's main characters. On the Spartan side, we have Archidamus II. So he's king of Sparta from 469 to 427 BC. So the first phase of the Peloponnesian War is called the Archidamian War, after this guy, Archidamus. So you can see on his Pokemon card, he uses the Ravage Attica attack, but it's not very effective. Sparta will have to come up with some more effective strategies under another military commander called Brasidas, which is this guy. But just going back to Archidamus very quickly, a fun fact about Archidamus is that he was fined for marrying a short woman. The Spartans complained that she would give birth to kinglets instead of kings. So I guess the Spartans were not into short kings. Okay, Brasidas. So Brasidas becomes the main Spartan general late in the Archidamian War, after Archidamus dies. So keep an eye out for him. He's going to die at the end of the Archidamian War. Okay, on Team Athens. To celebrate the grand final yesterday, we have a football team sheet. So the halfback, Pericles, he's got the best strategy for victory. You might remember him from last week. He's the main Athenian leader at the start of the Archidamian War, but he's going to die shortly from the plague. 5/8, Cleon. He keeps trying to take the team in another direction. So there's going to be a number of leaders who step up to replace Pericles. One of the main ones is Cleon. The funny thing is, Thucydides hates Cleon. So we get a very negative portrayal of him. Demosthenes, he's sort of like the hooker, the unsung hero, does all the hard work on the field. He's going to play a major role in this week's class and also next week, so keep an eye out for him. He is a brilliant general, but he does not seem to have had wider political influence like Cleon and Nicias. Nicias, the bench player, the bench utility, versatile as both general and politician. So he's going to play a very big role over the next 2 weeks. Nicias basically becomes leader of the conservatives who oppose Cleon. So Thucydides loves this guy and is quite biased towards him. Like, we'll see more of that later. Okay, this is a timeline of the Peloponnesian War. So our concept of the Peloponnesian War as going from 431 to 404 goes back to Thucydides. He says the war lasted 27 years. Otherwise, if it wasn't for Thucydides, we might have considered the Peloponnesian War to actually be 2 separate wars separated by a peace treaty. However, Thucydides attacks those who take this view. He says the war lasted altogether 27 years. Anyone who thinks the intervening period of truce did not amount to war is wrong. So modern historians see the whole conflict as one war. However, we break it up into these 3 divisions. So firstly, the Archidamian War, and that's going to be the topic of today. So as we just said, the Archidamian War is named after King Archidamus. He actually dies quite early on, but he still gets the war named after him. That's because from the Athenian point of view, the main feature of this part of the war was that Archidamus kept invading Attica. He would invade with the ground forces of Sparta and burn down the crops and the buildings. But then he had to leave again, because Sparta did not have the resources to besiege the city of Athens itself. So this first period of the war goes for exactly 10 years, 431 to 421. So it's also known as the 10-year war. That's what Thucydides himself calls it. So the next section is the Peace of Nicias from 421 down to 413. It's called the Peace of Nicias after the Athenian politician, Nicias. So he was the main negotiator for the Athenians. So they naturally named the peace treaty after him. The defining event of this period is the Sicilian expedition, and we'll talk about that in detail next week. Basically, the Athenians launched this massive invasion of Sicily, even though the war with Sparta hasn't been resolved. So it's just a bit of self-sabotage. Thucydides hates the decision to invade Sicily, and he criticizes it constantly. And the final section of the Peloponnesian War is called the Ionian War. Sometimes you might see it called the Decelean War. It's called the Ionian War because Sparta finally acquires a competitive navy. So most of the fighting takes place between naval forces over in Ionia. You'll see some books will also call this the Decelean War. This is because the Spartans set up a permanent fort inside Attica at a place called Decelea. This allowed them to devastate Athenian territory all year round, as opposed to back in the Archidamian War when they had to go home again. So those are the 3 sections of the Peloponnesian War. This week, we're going to be looking at the Archidamian War. So let's talk about sources. We already spoke about Thucydides last week. Today, we're going to look specifically at the issues with using Thucydides for the Archidamian War. So the biggest problem is that he's biased towards Pericles and Nicias. So for example, if you contrast Thucydides books 1 and 2 and Plutarch's Life of Pericles, you get very different pictures of Pericles. Thucydides only records how Pericles was a brilliant statesman with all the best policies that everyone agreed with. Plutarch gives us a much fuller picture and shows there was some opposition to Pericles, and people were trying to bring Pericles down by prosecuting everyone close to him. The other major issue with Thucydides is that he hates Cleon. So we'll talk more about this in detail a bit later when we get to Cleon. But just 2 major examples are the first, the Battle of Pylos. Thucydides portrays the entire episode of the Battle of Pylos in a way that makes it seem that Cleon just wins this massive victory against the Spartans completely by accident. And the other major example is in book 5.10, when Cleon dies. So according to Thucydides, Cleon runs away and gets shot in the back like a coward. So these are the issues that we have with Thucydides during the Archidamian War and the biases that he has. Okay, we'll just quickly review the context of why the war is breaking out. So this is just a quick review of what we did last week. So you might remember back in 446 BC, the First Peloponnesian War came to an end. Athens and Sparta signed a peace treaty, which was called the 30 Years' Peace. The main clause of the treaty was that neither side was allowed to commit aggression against the other for a period of 30 years. That might seem like a random time period, but the reason they chose 30 years was because that represents roughly one generation. So the idea was that there should be peace for about a generation. However, a point comes when both sides accuse the other of breaking the treaty. Athens and the Peloponnesian War indirectly go to war over the island of Corcyra in 433 BC. This situation then gets repeated at Potidaea in 432. You might remember last week, the city of Potidaea revolts from the Athenian Empire, and the Peloponnesian League unofficially sends soldiers to help defend the city. So once again, the two power blocks, Athens and the Peloponnesian League, are indirectly and unofficially at war. Athens was also putting immense pressure on Megara, which was an ally of Sparta. And they were doing this through an economic blockade, which was known as the Megarian Decree. The political climate at this time must have been one of immense tension. The sources all say that most people thought that war was inevitable. And so finally, in 432 BC, a meeting of the Peloponnesian League is held to vote on whether to declare war. So the Peloponnesian League has a two-step process for making decisions. So step one here, a decision has to be made by the Spartans themselves in their assembly. The Spartans vote through acclamation. So whoever shouts the loudest wins. And the Spartans vote that Athens has broken the 30 Years' Treaty and that war should be declared. So step two, this motion then has to be put to the Peloponnesian League. Each city gets one vote, and the majority vote to declare war in late 432. But the war itself does not begin straight away. So following the decision to declare war on Athens, there was a period of negotiations late 432 leading into early 431. Sparta made a series of ultimatums to Athens. The first ultimatum was that Athens should drive out the curse of the Alcmeonids. Yes, the curse of the Alcmeonids is back again. So Pericles is descended from the Alcmeonids on his mother's side. So the Spartans are hoping that Pericles would either be sent into exile or at the very least just be made unpopular. But it doesn't work. Pericles is extremely popular at this point. The Spartans also demand that the siege at Potidaea be lifted and that the Megarian Decree be revoked. Thucydides says these ultimatums were being used as pretexts and that Sparta was actually just using the time to make preparations for war. So now, on the Athenian side, intense debate was held in the Athenian assembly over how to respond to these ultimatums. And this is actually the site of the assembly. That's the speaker's platform. You can still go and see that today. So remember, Thucydides is biased towards Pericles. So Thucydides just tells us that Pericles advised to ignore the ultimatums and that the Athenians all agreed to this. Plutarch gives us another perspective. He says that there were arguments in favor of negotiation, and some people argued that they should just revoke the Megarian Decree and avoid a war. However, Pericles was obviously able to override the anti-war party and carried the vote. Thucydides says he gave a particularly inspiring speech. And one of the major historical debates is how reliable are the speeches in Thucydides? And that's the topic of this week's tutorial. So something to think about is how useful are the speeches that Thucydides gives us. So just to finish this section, the Athenian assembly votes to ignore the ultimatums of Sparta. So diplomacy comes to an end and hostilities begin. So let's look at the goals of each side. So the goal of Sparta basically was to end the Athenian Empire. So Thucydides says the Athenians had begun to encroach upon Sparta's allies. And it was at this point Sparta felt the position to be no longer tolerable. And Sparta decided by starting this war to destroy the power of Athens. So that's goal number one, destroy the Athenian military and be the dominant power in Greece. Goal number two, end the Athenian Empire and liberate Greece. So they were probably hoping to return to the situation in the Archaic period when they were the unchallenged leading military power in Greece. And in fact, this is what they do achieve by the end of the Peloponnesian War. Sorry, spoiler alert. Okay, so over on the other side with Athens, the goal of Athens was very simple. It was simply outlast Sparta's annual invasions. So basically, they want to maintain the status quo, two major powers, and just outlast Sparta's annual invasions and make them realize there's no point trying to end the Athenian Empire. So Pericles gives a long speech in Thucydides and goes for pages, but basically says we must safeguard the sea and the city. If we just outlast these annual invasions, that will be considered success. So Sparta, of course, quite famously, has the best land army in Greece. So their main strategy is going to be to launch land invasions of Athenian territory. It's difficult to get exact figures. Plutarch gives us this number. The first invasion of Attica was done with 60,000 soldiers. You might remember from a couple of weeks ago, the full army of Athens consisted of 13,000 frontline hoplites. They've also got 16,000 reserves. So even if they mustered their entire army, that still only comes to about 30,000, which is half the size of the army of the Peloponnesian League. So the Spartans are hoping that the Athenians will be embarrassed at seeing their land destroyed, and that they will march out to fight. The Athenians are not stupid. They're not going to take those odds of being outnumbered 2-1. The Peloponnesian League did have some naval forces. So they've got about 120 ships at the start of the Peloponnesian War. But it's just not enough to seriously threaten Athens' naval superiority. So we did talk about this a few weeks ago. Remember, the full Athenian navy has around 300 ships. So here in naval forces, the advantage is reversed the other way. It's Athens that has a 2-1 advantage. And the final thing is economic resources. So Athens has a major advantage in economic resources. They've got massive cash reserves and a massive annual income from the Athenian Empire. In contrast, the Spartan economy doesn't produce a cash surplus. And we'll see how that creates problems later on. Okay, so this is a timeline of the Archidamian War. These are the main events that we're going to be discussing. So basically, there's two major phases. Phase one is a stalemate, and both sides struggle to make any significant impact on the other side. And then from 425 onwards, we get phase two, where the war really opens up. So in phase one, two major events, plague hits Athens and the revolt of Mytilene. And then in phase two, when the war opens up, we get these two major battles, Battle of Pylos, Battle of Amphipolis. And basically that leads to the Peace of Nikias. So those are the events that we're going to be discussing now. So we're going to start with phase one and stalemate. Phase one, stalemate. Okay, early in 431, the Peloponnesian League musters a huge army of 60,000 soldiers and begins to march towards Athens. So once again, just like in the Persian Wars, the Athenians have to make a monumental decision about how to face this huge invasion. This time, Instead of evacuating the city, like in the Persian Wars, they do the opposite. They withdraw their entire population into the city. Basically, the plan is just to be like the French taunter in Monty Python. They're just going to sit behind the walls and just wait for the Spartans to go home. An interesting point is that this is not something Pericles thought up the night before. The Athenian strategy of sitting out an attack was a long time in the making. So they had begun constructing these walls back in the 460s, which is about 30 years earlier. So there was a long-term plan for this war with Sparta. So the plan is simple but effective. The city of Athens is a few kilometers inland, but by building these long walls down to the harbor, they can connect the city to the harbor. And this basically makes Athens invincible to a siege, since the city can always be supplied by her superior navy. Pericles famously says, we must try to think of ourselves as an island. We must abandon our land. So the entire population of Attica withdraws into the city of Athens, and they prepare to sit out the Spartan invasion. Thucydides gives a vivid description of the city as overflowing with people, and people are camping out in the temples and in the walls. It must be people camping all along here. So basically, that then results in a stalemate. What happens when the best army attacks the best navy? Stalemate. So what happens in this first 5 years is that neither side is able to gain a decisive advantage over the other. So basically, the Spartans, so if you imagine the map continues down here, Spartans down here, the Spartans march up into Attica and just set everything on fire, burn everything down. They were hoping to humiliate Athens and force them into battle. And they honestly believed, Thucydides says that the Spartans believed that this strategy would make Athens surrender within about 3 years. But of course, this didn't happen. The reason why the Spartan invasions were ineffective was because they were too short. So the longest one was only 40 days. So Sparta just doesn't have the economic resources to maintain a long campaign. So compare that 40 days to what Athens is able to do if someone revolts from the Athenian Empire. We spoke last week about Potidaea. So when Potidaea revolts from the Athenian Empire, the Athenians are able to siege the city for 2 years non-stop because they have these huge cash reserves and they're able to fund their army. Whereas the Spartans can't keep up an invasion for more than a month and they have to go home. So economics is playing a role in creating the stalemate. And there's Archidamus with his Ravage Attica attack. The next major event is the plague outbreak. So this is something we can all relate to because we all lived through a plague outbreak. I'm sure you remember how unsettling it was when the coronavirus first appeared and the first people started dying. Now imagine there was a world war happening at the same time, and you'll get an idea of how unsettling the situation in Athens must have been. So in the summer of 430, a pandemic breaks out in Athens, and that is today's word of the day, pandemic. It's 2 separate Greek nouns joined together. Pan meaning all, and demos, the people. So pandemic, when all the people get sick at once. Okay, so the first cases appear in the Piraeus harbor. So it's a bit like Corona, the first cases appeared in the airports. So somebody had brought the disease into the city after getting off a ship. So the disease then spread rapidly through Athens because of the overcrowding in the city. So the plague was an unforeseen side effect of withdrawing the entire population into the city. Thucydides himself fought the plague, but luckily he managed to survive. And he gives us a detailed description of what it was like. So it's much worse than Corona. These are the symptoms: coughing, stomachache, vomiting, diarrhea, and your whole body gets covered in ulcers. There's been some very interesting work done on this by modern scientists. So a mass grave was found from this period. It's probably like, a huge group of people that died from the plague. And they did DNA analysis on the skeletons, and traces of typhus were found. So this is a disease which still breaks out today in overcrowded situations like refugee camps. If you have time, I recommend you read this passage of Thucydides, the book 249 to book 252. This might give you flashbacks to 2020. So Thucydides describes mass graves, piles of dead bodies, people filled with uncertainty and terror and unsure of whether they should go visit their relatives or just stay at home. Anyone who survived the plague was congratulated because it was very rare to catch the disease twice. Plutarch records that the disease devastated Pericles' family. So it killed 2 of Pericles' sons, his sister, most of his relatives, and finally, Pericles himself caught the plague and died. So, okay, impacts of the plague. So basically, they didn't have masks, vaccine, there was no enforced social distancing and no lockdown. So the only course was to wait for the plague to run its course. The disease seems to have finally petered out after a few years, around 426 BC. So Plutarch says 4,400 hoplites were killed. So out of a total of 13,000, that means they lost about a third of their army, and not even in battle, just a third of the army just got wiped out in the plague. Thucydides himself says, nobody knows how many ordinary people died because there were so many deaths. Modern estimates are that around 100,000 people were killed, which represents about a quarter of the population of Athens. So that means more Athenians died from the plague than from the war itself. And there was some cultural impact. It was around this time that the play Oedipus Rex was written by Sophocles. So this famous play begins with Oedipus asking why everyone in the city is weeping and lamenting. And the priest, his character, he replies, because the city is being destroyed by a plague. And this is from a performance in America in 2021, when plague themes were again relevant. Okay, the next major event after the plague is the revolt of Mytilene in 428. So Mytilene is another one of these beautiful places that you should visit if you get the chance. So you can see Mytilene has this really big harbor, and that allowed them to build up a small navy and revolt from the Athenian Empire. So Mytilene is over here on the other side of the Aegean Sea. It's on the island of Lesbos. So Mytilene is famous for being the home of the poet Sappho, and we're going to talk about her in a tutorial in week 12. So in 428 BC, the government of Mytilene decided that Athens was distracted by the plague, so they took this opportunity to revolt from the Athenian Empire. Thucydides gives us this speech. So again, you have to decide how historical it is. And in this speech, a person from Mytilene explains that they feel oppressed by the Athenian Empire. He says, when we saw that they were becoming less antagonistic towards Persia and more interested in enslaving their own allies, then we became frightened. It was more through terror than through friendship that we were held together in the alliance. So he's basically trying to justify why they're revolting. They want their freedom. So it could be an accurate reflection of what inspired the government of Mytilene to revolt, even if perhaps Thucydides made the speech up. So Athens sends out a force of just 40 ships to go across to Mytilene. Just 40 ships, so that's probably a sign of how the plague has affected Athens. So prior to the plague, they probably would have sent out a larger force. They also send out 1,000 hoplites, and this force besieges the city. And we've spoken about this over the last couple of weeks. So remember, the Athenians had become experts at siege warfare from the necessity of dealing with rebels. So they besiege Mytilene for a year, and eventually the people of Mytilene run out of food and they have to surrender. There is this funny story right at the end of the siege, when out of desperation, the government decides to issue hoplite armor to the people. But the people instead rise up against the government and demand that the remaining food supplies be fairly shared out. And that's the end of the revolt of Mytilene. What happens next is one of the most famous sets of speeches in the whole of Thucydides. It's called the Mytilenean debate. So if you're doing the essay on the topic of speeches in Thucydides, this could be a good set of speeches to choose. So the context is Mytilene has surrendered, and the Athenian assembly has to decide what to do with the city. So Thucydides says that there was a furious mood in the assembly, and Cleon passes this motion to kill the entire male population of Mytilene and enslave the women and children. So a ship was then sent to Mytilene with orders to execute the entire population. But the very next day, Thucydides says, this quote up here, there was a sudden change of feeling, and people began to think how cruel and unprecedented was such a decision to destroy not only the guilty, but the entire population of a state. So the next day, a second debate is held. Thucydides gives us these two speeches, one from Cleon and one from Diodotus, who is otherwise unknown. So this is the first appearance of Cleon in Thucydides' history. So Cleon, he'd been a long-term political opponent of Pericles. For example, he had criticized Pericles' policy of withdrawing into the city. So now that Pericles is dead, Cleon is able to come to the fore. So Thucydides does not like him. Thucydides is the group admin of the We Hate Cleon Facebook group, basically. So, for example, Thucydides calls Cleon the most violent man in Athens and calls him a demagogue. And Thucydides inserts this huge editorial comment into Book 2. He interrupts the narrative and presents his interpretation of events. So according to Thucydides, after the death of Pericles, there was a rise in these incompetent demagogues who eventually destroyed Athens through their bad decisions. So this long quote, Thucydides says, during the whole of the period of peace, when Pericles was at the head of affairs, the state was wisely led and firmly guarded. It was under him that Athens was at her greatest. But Pericles' successors adopted methods of demagoguery, which resulted in their losing control over the actual conduct of affairs and losing the war. So you can see a couple of things in this passage. You can see Thucydides' obvious bias towards Pericles, thinks he was the best thing ever. Also, Thucydides' despair over Athens losing the war, and this is why he hates the demagogues so much. So don't take Thucydides' word for it. Judge for yourself how effective Cleon was as a leader and what role Cleon played in the war. And so there's basically, just in summary, there's two reasons why Thucydides hates Cleon, just political and social. So the political is that they are political opponents. Thucydides is a supporter of Pericles, and Cleon he's the leader of the anti-Pericles party, right? So they're on opposite sides. And the social aspect is that they're from different social classes. So Thucydides is part of the established elite, and Cleon is part of the middle class. That's why he hates him. Sorry, I just need to take a drink of water. My throat is very, very dry. Okay, so that was a crash course introduction to Cleon. So back in 427, the Athenian assembly has just decided to execute all the men of Mytilene, and this debate is then held to reconsider this motion. So Cleon was the one who proposed wiping out the population of Mytilene, and he argues in favor of sticking to this. It's actually a great speech. One of Cleon's killer lines is that the Mytileneans must be punished. Otherwise, the only alternative is to surrender your empire so you can go in for philanthropy. This other guy, Diodotus, then responds, and this is also a very good speech. So it's the first recorded argument against the death penalty, which is another fact that makes the Mytilenean debate very special. So Diodotus says, even with the death penalty, the laws are still broken. Either we must discover some fear more powerful than the fear of death, or we must admit that here we have not got an adequate deterrent. So the vote is held again, and this time the Athenians vote not to execute all the men of Mytilene. The problem is they already sent a ship to Mytilene with orders to execute everyone. So another ship is sent, and they have to row as fast as they can all the way across the Aegean. They actually go non-stop all night. They row for 24 hours non-stop, this 300 kilometers, and they take it in turns in shifts. So one shift sleeps, one shift rows, so that they can go without stopping. And Thucydides says the first ship arrived in Mytilene, and the Athenian commander got the message to execute everyone. And he's just about to carry out the order when the second ship pulls in with the message not to carry out the order. Very dramatic. Okay, so that is then the end of phase 1. We now come to phase 2 when the war opens up. So the next major event is the Battle of Pylos in 425 BC. So this is when things start to open up. Both Sparta and Athens figure out how to break the stalemate, and they start inflicting serious military losses on the other side. And eventually, they inflict enough damage on each other that they agree to a peace treaty. So speaking of peace treaties, we have some extra evidence for the year 425 that's not in Thucydides. So it's a play by Aristophanes called The Arcanians. So the plot of the play is that the main character, Dicaeopolis, makes a private peace treaty between himself and Sparta. So he no longer has to fight in the war. Now that he's at peace, he relaxes while everyone else has to keep fighting, and he gets drunk with some slave girls. So one of the essay topics you can choose is that you can get a play of Aristophanes and analyze it for historical information. So this is certainly a cool one you could choose. Were people sick of the war in 425 BC and fantasizing about making private peace treaties? Well, that's something you can decide in your assignment. So 425 BC, the Athenians finally come up with a plan for opening up the war and inflicting some damage on Sparta. So the Athenian general Demosthenes sails down and around, gets down to Pylos down here, and he builds a base here at Pylos. And you see it's just a short distance away from Sparta. So we'll just go back. So if we zoom in on Pylos down there, this is what Pylos looks like. So this is the little headland here where Demosthenes builds a little fortress. The other Athenian commanders think this is a crazy idea. They actually say, look, this is a waste of time. Why are we doing this? But it has a number of very important purposes. So building a fort here can stir up a rebellion of helots. The runaway helots can seek refuge here, and it can be used to raid the surrounding countryside. So it has a lot of really good uses. Initially, the Spartans don't see this as a serious threat. They think this improvised little fort should be really easy to capture. But just to be sure, when the Spartans march out against Pylos, they take a number of precautions. So they place a force of 400 men on this island. So that's so the Athenians can't use the island as a base and land reinforcements here while the Spartan army is over here. So the Spartans think, okay, let's put some men there and we'll put 60 ships in the harbor so the Athenians can't sail in with reinforcements, and then we'll attack the fortress. So the Spartans think this is all under control. Everything's going really well. The Spartans then march their main army around here and attack the Athenian fort from the landward side. But the landward side is very, very heavily fortified and difficult to attack. So you can't tell on the map, but this is actually quite steep, and this is up on a high ridge. So it's very, very easy to defend, very, very hard to attack from this side. So what the Spartans then do is they sail around and attack from the seaward side as well, over down here. And they try to land some men on the shore. This is the first appearance of the Spartan commander Brasidas, going to play a big role in this part of the war. So, that section there, right there, is this section here, with the rocks facing out to the sea. And so the Spartans are trying to land their ships here on the rocks. And Brasidas actually shouts at the captains, "Don't worry about the ships. Just crash the ships into the rocks so that we can charge ashore." So the ships crash into the rocks. Brasidas charges ashore, and the fighting is really heavy. So you imagine the Athenians charging down here, the Spartans are charging up here. It's very, very heavy fighting. Brasidas actually gets knocked out, and he falls back into his ship, and Brasidas drops his shield on the ground. And the Athenians later pick it up and keep it as a trophy of this battle. And it's now on display at the Agora Museum in Athens. And that's it there. It's a very cool link to history, although it's not much to look at now. It's just a rusted lump of bronze, but very, very cool. Definitely a highlight of going to the Agora Museum and seeing that. Thucydides also remarks on how ironic this whole situation was. So the Athenians are fighting on land, and the Spartans are trying to attack with ships. It's a complete reversal of how things normally happen. So the Spartans are not able to capture this fortress. So go back to the map. They're not able to attack from the landward side, and they can't get a landing ashore from the seaward side. So it's just such a great geographical position. It's really difficult to capture. So it's very, very clever by Demosthenes to put this fort here. So then what happens is the Athenian reinforcements arrive. So 50 Athenian ships sail in and attack the 60 Spartan ships. And the Athenians, of course, are much, much better sailers. So even though Sparta has more ships, the Athenians are more skillful at sailing and manage to sink the 60 ships and defeat them. So when this happens, Thucydides says the enormity of the situation suddenly dawned on the Spartans. At this sight, the Spartans were overwhelmed with horror. It meant that their own men were now cut off on the island. So remember, they put 400 men down here. Well, they're now trapped. So somehow, what had seemed like a really simple task and an easy victory had turned into this shocking reversal. The Spartans were so determined to get these 400 men back that they immediately send an embassy asking for peace. However, if Pericles was still alive, this incredible turn of events might have been the end of the war. But Cleon is now the leading force at Athens, and he refuses to negotiate. He basically ends the negotiations by making demands that the Spartan ambassadors can't agree to. They're just completely unreasonable. So the war continues. The Athenians keep up the blockade of Sphacteria. Oh, sorry, this island is called Sphacteria, but it's normally called the Battle of Pylos, because the area is called Pylos. So the Athenians, with their 50 ships, keep the island of Sphacteria blockaded. The ships are constantly circling the island night and day, non-stop, so that the Spartans can't rescue their men. However, the Spartans are actually very clever, and they manage to run the blockade. They make helots swim across to the island at nighttime with food supplies. You can actually try this yourself. It's a very nice place to go swimming. I mean, don't try swimming across to the island at nighttime while carrying supplies for Spartan soldiers, but you can go swimming there. There's a lot of people swimming there. I actually was there about 10 years ago, and had a friend who actually swam all the way across. She was very, very fit. I did not try swimming all the way across. It's about, from this point on the beach across to the island, it's about 1 kilometer. So you've got to be quite fit, very good at swimming. Okay, so the other funny thing that happens is some of the helots, Thucydides has this story that some of the helots do an insurance job. So they get their boats valued, then run the blockade and crash their ships into the island and get the insurance payout. Presumably they then had to swim back, so it wasn't an easy way to get money. Anyway, so the Spartans are managing to run the blockade and keep the men supplied, so the men don't surrender. Now, the Athenians had expected to capture the Spartans quite quickly, but because the Spartans are able to get food supplies across, the blockade drags out for a month. So now, all right, so the blockade drags out for a month, and now Cleon becomes very unpopular. The mood at Athens shifts against Cleon. Cleon is now very unpopular because he was the one that turned down the peace negotiations, and everyone realizes, oh, we should have accepted that. So what happens next is another extremely dramatic meeting of the Athenian assembly. Cleon attacks the generals, and he says, well, a competent general would have captured the Spartans by now. He actually says they aren't real men. He's really trying to insult them. But the insult backfires when Nicias, the general, he says, okay, well, you take the command and you go capture the Spartans. So at first, Cleon thinks he's only joking, but Nicias insists that he's being serious. This is all according to Thucydides. So Cleon then agrees that he will take the command at Pylos. Then he tops it all off with this crazy wager. He says that he won't take any extra forces. He will capture the Spartans with just the soldiers who are already there, and he will do it all within 20 days. And Thucydides says everybody laughed. This irresponsible claim caused an amount of laughter. And Thucydides also says that people hoped that Cleon would die attacking the Spartans. I have a feeling Thucydides was just describing his own reaction. Okay, so Cleon arrives at Pylos, and you might remember the general on the spot is Demosthenes. So Demosthenes already had a plan to capture the Spartans. So a fire is lit, which burns down the forest so that the Athenians can get a clear view of where the Spartans are. And then, just before dawn, the Athenians land on the island down the bottom, and they take the Spartans by surprise. Many of them are still sleeping, and they're not expecting an attack. One interesting point is the massive respect that the Athenians have for the Spartan soldiers. There are 400 Spartans on this island. The Athenians attack with 15,000 troops. So Demosthenes then cleverly assaults the Spartans from all directions with light armed troops. The light armed troops rain down missiles on the Spartans, and Spartans can't attack in any particular direction because the light armed troops will simply retreat. And basically just using this overwhelming numerical superiority, they just keep shooting and shooting the Spartans and just push them back until they push the Spartans all the way back to this cliff top. And Thucydides has this very dramatic quote, just gives you an idea of what the fighting was like. He says, things began to go hard with the Spartans. Their helmets could not keep out the arrows, spears stuck in their armor. Words of command were inaudible. Danger was on every side. So the Spartans are pushed back to the cliff and they're surrounded. And this wasn't Thermopylae. Cause just wasn't that great. So they're not prepared to fight to the last man and to the death. So they finally surrender. So of the 400 who were originally on the island, some of them had died in the fighting. So the Athenians capture 292 prisoners. So this is not just a massive military victory, it's also a major political victory. The Spartans are stunned that they've lost all these men. And they immediately ask for a peace treaty to get their men back. Might seem crazy, but the Athenians again refuse to accept terms. They want the war to continue. They're actually hoping to win even more. So the Athenians are like problem gamblers. They're on a winning streak and they want to keep playing. Remember, it's always better to cash out when you're ahead. Always gamble responsibly. So 2 final things about the Battle of Pylos. So Cleon was obviously the man of the moment. He returns to Athens with the prisoners within the 20 days that he had promised. So shortly afterwards, Aristophanes produces a play called The Knights. So the entire plot of this play is satirizing Cleon. The other note about Pylos is that Pylos, so the fortress here at Pylos, continues to be highly effective. So Helots begin to desert and begin to run away to this base at Pylos. And the soldiers who are in Pylos conduct these raids out into Spartan territory. So the Spartans are so terrified that the Helots will revolt. They actually massacre 2,000 Helots, basically just to terrorize them into not rebelling. Okay, the next thing that happens is the flamethrower. So Athens is on this winning streak, but their luck is about to run out. So just after the Battle of Pylos, the Athenians have this ambitious plan to replicate their success. So they send a force up into Boeotia and they capture an area around the temple of Apollo at Delium. And they build a temporary little fort around it. So it's just the same plan as over at Pylos, but this time it doesn't work. So the Athenians capture the temple of Apollo. They dig a ditch around it and use the soil to build a rampart, and then they cut down trees and make a wall. So you'll notice that their fort has a wooden wall. The Boeotians notice that as well. So they create a giant flamethrower to burn it down. And yeah, as I said before, it's one of the earliest recorded flamethrowers in history. This is a model of what it might have looked like just based on the description in Thucydides 4100. Basically, there was a fire in here and they used fans to force the fire down the pipe and out the other side and burn the walls down. So yeah, it's quite effective. It burns down this wooden fort and the Athenians have to abandon their position. So the Athenians only have so much luck with wooden walls. Okay, so the Spartans have been warned. If they invade Attica, the Athenians will put to death the Spartan prisoners. So the Spartans finally have to come up with some new ideas. And they do this under the leadership of the brilliant general Brasidas, the guy who dropped his shield back at Pylos. So the Spartan plan is to get an army up here into this area called the Chalkidiki. So this is a sensitive area of the Athenian Empire. It's got a lot of important resources. And if the Spartans can stir up rebellion and get cities to revolt, it'll pay the Athenians back for Pylos by inflicting some damage in Athenian territory. So remember the Peloponnesian navy had basically been wiped out at the Battle of Pylos. So Brasidas has to actually physically march all the way up Greece to get to the Chalkidiki. So he has a force of mercenaries and helots. So the Spartans aren't willing to risk their frontline troops now. They're freaked out about how they lost those soldiers back at Pylos. And Brasidas arrives up at Chalkidiki, and immediately two small cities revolt, Stagira and Acanthus. They're just two little cities in here. So Brasidas then marches on the main city in this area, which is Amphipolis. So this city is important for a number of reasons. So there's economics, it provides precious metals and timber, and there's also military reasons. It's just a very strategic spot. It controls the crossing into Thrace, basically. So Brasidas arrives at Amphipolis, camps his army outside the city, and the Athenian commander in Amphipolis immediately sends for help from the nearest Athenian general. And this is none other than Thucydides himself. So Thucydides is nearby on the island of Thasos, and he immediately sails across to try and rescue Amphipolis. Oh, sorry, I'll have to have another drink. Okay, so Brasidas offers extremely moderate terms. He says everyone can stay in the city, anyone who wants to leave can go, and you can take your property with you. The inhabitants of the city were expecting much worse. So they decided, look, let's just surrender. So Thucydides sails in and finds that the city has already fallen. So for failing to protect Amphipolis, he actually gets exiled. So Thucydides gets exiled from Athens. And now that he has nothing to do, he starts writing history instead. So the fall of Amphipolis was so shocking that the Athenians agree to a 1-year truce. Next slide. So 423, the Athenians agree to a 1-year truce. The Spartans are hoping that once the Athenians get a taste of peace, they will decide to a long-term deal. But it's actually the opposite, and that's probably because of the warmongering policies of Cleon. So as soon as the truce expires in 422, Cleon leads an army up to Amphipolis. So Cleon has a force of 30 ships and about 1,600 hoplites. And he bases himself down here. So the Athenians have a little fort down here on the harbor. They've lost the city of Amphipolis, but they still control this fortress down here. And Brasidas is in control of the city. And remember, he's got a force of mercenaries and helots. And just one other notable thing about Amphipolis, as you can see, it's in this strategic position, surrounded by the river. So all they had to do is build a wall across here, basically, and you're surrounded by the river on the other side. So it's a city that's quite easy to defend. So what's going to happen now is that we have the last major event of the Archidamian War, the Battle of Amphipolis. And Thucydides wants to portray Cleon as inexperienced and out of his depth. But you have to judge for yourself the character of Cleon. It does seem true that at Amphipolis, Cleon was defeated by Brasidas' superior skills as a general. So what happens is Cleon's down here at this base at the harbor, and he's waiting for more reinforcements. You see he is slightly outnumbered, and he wants more reinforcements to arrive so that he can have a numerical advantage, just like at Pylos. But while he's waiting, the men get really restless. So Cleon decides what he'll do is he'll just march up and just have a look around, right? That's what he actually says. I'm just going to do some reconnaissance. We'll just march up, have a look around, and then we'll march back again. So he has no intention of fighting. He just wants to give the men something to do. So they march up, Cleon has a look around, and then he actually turns the army around and starts marching them back down, back to their base. So Brasidas has been watching all this, and he sees that this is a really good opportunity. So once the army is actually turned around and is marching back the other way, that's when he just suddenly launches his army out and attacks the Athenians when they're not actually prepared. Again, all we have is Thucydides, and Thucydides hates Cleon. And Thucydides is determined to betray Cleon in the worst possible light, right to the very end. So Thucydides says that Cleon immediately turned around and ran as fast as he could. Cleon immediately ran away and was shot. It seems that the Athenian army was never in good formation, and they were quite easily defeated. And that's the end of the Battle of Amphipolis. And just quickly, oh no, I don't have a slide, sorry. So even though the Spartans had won, Brasidas was injured in the fighting, and he dies shortly afterwards. All right, it's down here, sorry. Brasidas is killed. He gets worshipped as a hero. They give him a special burial in the city of Amphipolis. The people of Amphipolis sacrifice to him as a hero, or a semi-divine person, and they make annual offerings to him. Okay, this is the end now. So now there's a strong mood for peace in both Sparta and Athens. So Sparta wants their prisoners back, and they want Pylos shut down, so the Helots stop rebelling. On the other side, Athens really wants Amphipolis back, and they were quite disheartened by their recent losses. It looks like Cleon was the leader of the pro-war party. So now with his death, there's an opportunity for Nicias to lead the peace efforts. And then Nicias is able to negotiate the peace treaty, which is called the Peace of Nicias. The mood for peace can be seen in Aristophanes' play this year called Peace. In the play, the hero rides a giant dung beetle up to heaven, and he frees the goddess Peace, who had been locked up. And the goddess Peace comes and brings peace to all the world. So after some intense negotiations, both sides finally sign the treaty, and it's supposed to last for 50 years. But spoilers, it's not going to last that long. To find out how the treaty gets broken and how the war continues, see you in next week's class. Thank you very much.